Now, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have seen the Netflix documentary Athlete A over the last few weeks. It covers the abuse scandal within USA Gymnastics, which resulted in the jailing of Larry Nassar, the former US Gymnastics team doctor, for the sexual assault of over 250 young gymnasts, including many US Olympic athletes and medalists. One of the journalists who exposed the story was Mark Alesia from the Indy Star newspaper in Indianapolis. Mark is on the line now. Evening, Mark.
Good evening. How are you?
Good. Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk to us. Athlete A has brought to a very wide audience over the last couple of months the shocking story of US Gymnastics, the story that you helped expose. You might go back 4 or 5 years ago when you first started investigating US Gymnastics, and if you had any idea as to what might follow.
No, I mean, we couldn't have. I mean, this has had worldwide impact now. I mean, our reporting has been out there for 4 years, but this really shows the power of a documentary film to bring the story to even more people. When we started, we knew we had an important story. I thought it would get a lot of attention in the U.S., and then after Nassar, I thought it would, and it was getting some international attention, but I never could have imagined this type of impact, the impact that the survivors, the brave survivors who trusted us with their story, they couldn't have believed that this would be the impact that they have.
When you first started investigating US Gymnastics, did Larry Nassar come into your thinking at all?
No, the first story was on the eve of the Rio Olympics in August of 2016. People thought that we were doing that just to get more attention. We weren't. That was when the story was ready, and we weren't going to publish till it was ready. The first story had nothing to do with Larry Nassar. I'd heard of him. He was a famous gymnastics doctor, but the first story was about USA Gymnastics policy of not reporting most complaints to law enforcement. The policy at the time was only if a complaint is signed by an athlete or an athlete's parent or guardian, which of course is exactly the wrong way to do it. And complaints that weren't signed by a parent or guardian were literally put away in a drawer. It wasn't until the day of publication that I heard that there might be something wrong with Larry Nassar.
The way you talk about US Gymnastics, even before this came out about Larry Nassar and just how despicable a human he was, US Gymnastics, it sounds like acted a lot like many major organizations like the Catholic Church, that people are moved to one side, waivers were signed here and there, and somehow or another, many abusers managed to keep working with young children for a long time. This was an organization that, all right, people now focus on Larry Nassar, but for a long period of time had a very lax attitude towards abuse.
Oh, absolutely. Probably for 10 or 20 years. My colleague, Marissa Kwiatkowski, in particular, focused on what we were calling pass the trash, where coaches who had been accused of sexual assault at one gym would be told by an owner who didn't want that to hurt his or her business, just go away, just leave town, we won't say anything, go away. And the person would go to another gym and start up all over again. And in some cases, it was gym to gym to gym to gym. It was really awful.
And that in itself is an horrific story. So when you start getting letters in, which by all accounts starts to happen very quickly after that initial publication on the eve of the Rio Olympics, from various different survivors of Larry Nassar, are you shocked by what you're reading, or does that fit in with what you've been investigating over the previous few months?
Well, what we got on the day of publication was really from one survivor of Larry Nassar, and that was Rachel Den Hollander, who is an absolute hero in this story. She emailed mid-morning on the day of publication and said, I wasn't abused by a coach. I was abused by a doctor. I'm not sure if you're interested, but I'm willing to go out there and put my name out publicly to my story. That was extraordinary. And she was out there alone for a long time. She was the only person accusing Nassar by name for a long time. And she was the leader of this group of survivors. She's still working for justice on this case.
What was the period then? What was the gap between Rachel Den Hollander coming forward and then this wave of survivors coming forward and starting to tell their story as well?
Well, what happened then was, before our first Nassar story, we learned that there was going to be a lawsuit filed in California by an anonymous gymnast who since has come out as Jamie Dancer, former Olympian. Then after that, so we had two people at that point. On a Sunday night, I got a phone call, a voicemail at work from Jessica Howard, a rhythmic gymnast. And I called her back right away, and her story matched almost exactly the types of things that Rachel and Jamie were alleging. And at that point, that's when I thought this could just be huge. And so we published after that. Our first Nassar story actually was only based on Rachel and Jamie, because Jessica at the time wasn't comfortable even as an anonymous source, but she was vital because her story gave us even more confidence to go ahead with the first Nassar story. When the first Nassar story was published, that's when we started to hear from people, and that's when we were able to document that people started going to the Michigan State University Police, where he worked, and started filing police reports that alleged crimes that had occurred 5 or 10 or 15 years earlier. So that's when that blew up.
In terms of the reaction at that time then from US Gymnastics, which it's clear from the documentary are a very powerful body with a lot of connections within law enforcement and also within society, in all societies, the lure of Olympic medals takes over and sport administrators will push the boundaries as far as possible in an awful lot of sporting bodies. What was the initial reaction from US Gymnastics? Did they come out all guns blazing to defend Larry Nassar? Or was there an acceptance that actually when they read your story, which came from a variety of different sources, as you say, it wasn't just elite athletes. Rachel Den Hollander wasn't an elite athlete, that it was people at different levels of gymnastics. Was there any acceptance from US Gymnastics that there was something very badly wrong going on here?
No, all we got from them was sort of a vague response that Larry had retired a year earlier. It almost sounded like, well, he's not our problem. He's not an employee or an associate of ours anymore. The real pushback came from people who loved Nassar. This was a beloved man. And we got all sorts of phone calls and emails, and especially the survivors, Rachel and Jamie, got all sorts of abuse from people accusing them of just being out for money, making comments about sexual history. It was just, it was terrible. And I mean, to really to illustrate how beloved this guy was, our first story about him came out in September of 2016. 2 months later, he was on the ballot in Holt, Michigan for a school board seat. At the time, he had verbally taken himself out of the race, but his name had to still be on the ballot. And he got 20% of the vote after all that we had published. And then it was later that month, I believe, that the child porn was found in his garbage. And
that was quite fortuitous, it turned out, as well. Sorry, Mark. The finding of the child porn, which was basically in his bin, had been dumped. And maybe if they turned up 2 days later, a week later, they wouldn't have found that. And you do wonder, would you be in this position now where Larry Nassar spending the rest of his life in jail if that little bit of luck hadn't happened? Or do you believe, actually, that the overwhelming weight of evidence would have just been enough?
I think the weight of evidence would have eventually come out, but Andrea Munford, the detective, another hero of this story, the detective with the Michigan State Police, is the one who directed the garbage search that turned up the child porn. But even then, some people were out there saying, well, the cops might have planted it. I mean, that's how far people would go to try to square what they knew about Larry Nassar personally with what was becoming increasingly apparent about his crimes.
Whenever there's a scenario like this with regards abuse, the question is, how could this have happened? And I remember when we covered this at the time when it was initially being reported, there was a lot of talk at the time of the Ranch, which was the coaching center in Texas where young gymnasts, and again, it got underlined here, a lot of these girls were very, very young at the time when they would go to the Ranch, which was basically a breeding ground for Olympians. And they were there with Bella and Marta Caroli, who were involved way back in the 70s and 80s with Nadia Comaneci and had this brilliant reputation and were worshipped in the USA, not just in US Gymnastics, but in US Olympic circles as well. And that they would take in these very young girls at a young age and bring them to the Ranch, as you can see in the documentary, an incredibly isolated spot, and would have to basically give up all contact with their family. It seems as though there was little or no protection or oversight at all as to what happened in the Ranch.
No, I mean, the Carolis, they controlled everything. And you're quite right. Families were not allowed to go there. The methods were working. So USA Gymnastics seemed happy with that, happy with the medals. But the Ranch has been described to me as just a place where the accommodations weren't very nice. The food wasn't very good. And when Nassar went there to treat, well, quote unquote, to actually commit his assault on Jessica Howard, it was in her bedroom. It was in her cabin. There wasn't sort of a clinical, a hospital space, a training space for treatment and that sort of thing. No, Larry Nassar was alone with her in her room. Oh, and of course, she was a minor. And
the Carolis' role in all of this, and maybe it is this the role and the attitude that's always been there in gymnastics towards getting to that elite level, that mental abuse just came naturally, that to be successful, you had to put up with an awful lot. And it was interesting listening to the testimonies of the survivors that you were put through so much in the Ranch that you got to a stage where you didn't really know what was acceptable and what wasn't, that to get to the very top, you had to suffer in whatever way that was going to be.
It appears that that's permeated through the whole sport internationally based on things that we're seeing now. I mean, the reports of sexual assault, or emotional abuse of gymnasts in the UK, and Australia is looking into that. I believe a German coach admitted he had been emotionally abusive. It seems to have just permeated the whole sport. And what we found was really not just at the very top levels, but even as you got to, in the U.S., we have levels 1 through 10 before you become sort of Olympic caliber. And even in the middle of those levels, you know, we were finding young girls, and they were girls, who thought their coach, that the coach was everything to them. Pleasing the coach was everything because he controlled, or she controlled, whether they would go to a level 6 meet and compete with their friends. They were with him or her for hours and hours each day. They were isolated often from their parents. Even in that situation, it was just it was a prescription for this abuse.
And that decision-making and the carrot of the dream and holding it out for these young athletes meant that they went along with an awful lot. And even then, though, when there were complaints, so this protection and this abuse was going right up until 2016, until he was arrested, ultimately, because there was a long gap as well from Maggie Nichols, who was a world champion gymnast in 2015, complains to her parents and is one of those who realises what has happened with the sexual abuse is wrong, goes to her parents, who then complain to US Gymnastics and to Steve Penny, who is in charge of US Gymnastics, and are basically told there's an investigation now underway, but whatever you do, don't speak to anybody about this because that could potentially sabotage the investigation. And then you end up in a situation where the investigation, of which there isn't one maybe actually happening, rolls on for well over a year, while Larry Nassar is still able to go on abusing people. Just before we get on to Steve Penny and that way he protected Larry Nassar, during your investigations, the protection of Nassar and the awareness of what he was doing, how early do you think people in US Gymnastics were aware of the abuse?
Officially, I mean, based on the evidence, it was when Maggie Nichols reported. But it's crucial to understand that gymnasts had reported Nassar to adults probably 10 years earlier.
Right.
There were Michigan State University gymnasts or one in particular, who went to her coach and told her what happened. And she was very close with Nassar and said, "Oh, no, you can't be right. Don't do this." There were girls who went to the police. And the police interviewed Nassar, and he was able to just convince them that this was just somebody who didn't really understand the difference between medical treatment and sexual abuse. There were plenty of opportunities. And even 1 year before our story, a woman went to the Title IX office at Michigan State University and made her complaint. And Nassar got off on that because the committee or the people evaluating the complaint included some of his cronies. They were there to analyze whether this was medical or not. And the ruling was in favor of Larry Nassar.
There's just countless shocking aspects to this. And Maggie Nichols' story, who ultimately because she made that complaint, misses out on the Rio Olympics, even though she should be part of the US team. The Carolis have the final say and she doesn't make it. And it is because of what had happened and because she had gone to her parents, and there's a level of punishment there with that. And when you're watching it, you look and realise her Olympic dream is over, and then you start to Wikipedia and look and see, well, maybe she can go to Rio in 2020 or go to Tokyo in 2020, and you realise she's only 22 now. She's still only 22 years of age, and to have gone through that, to have had to survive through that sexual abuse, towards the disappointment of her dream being taken away, the strength and the character that so many of these women have had to show at a disgustingly young age is remarkable.
Maggie Nichols, I don't think this was part of the film. It might have been. Maggie Nichols went on to win the national championship in the NCAA in college. And there's been a lot of discussion here about how our university gymnastics programs are really what the sport should be. And gymnasts have come out and talked about how they've sort of rediscovered the joy of the sport. It's a beautiful sport. It's a grueling mental and physical sport too, but it's beautiful. And these athletes, all of us, they just regain this idea that we can have fun and be joyful while we're competing. It's such a contrast from the Olympic level and the club level.
You mentioned right at the start the impact that this has had worldwide, and I'm sure it's had a huge impact on you as well, and you get that sense from the documentary. How could it not, when you get to know all these incredibly personal stories? And you mentioned Rachel Den Hollander, who is very much to the forefront, and you can't help but think that the survivors in many ways they were very fortunate to have somebody as impressive a communicator as Rachel Den Hollander out there in front, because as I touched on there, like Maggie Nichols is 22, an awful lot of these are still very young women who don't want to be thrust into the spotlight, that they had such a brilliant advocate who was able to get across in those statements exactly the impact it had on their lives.
When I first interviewed Rachel in August, before our first Nassar story, the way you just described her came across even then. She was an attorney who was staying home to homeschool children, but she just came across as so smart, so sincere, not a touch of guile. And that made her so believable to me. Now, of course, we had to keep going, keep reporting. But you're quite right. the judge at Nassar's sentencing in the state trial or the state sentencing, there was no trial, he pleaded guilty. The judge there referred to Rachel as the 5-star general of the survivors. And I thought, that's perfect. Yes, she is. And you know what? They're still working to get some justice. Even the Nassar case isn't closed. The U.S. Senate is trying to find out why the FBI failed so horribly in investigating this. The survivors want more documents that are being withheld by Michigan State University through attorney-client privilege. They want the school to release those so people who knew could be held accountable. Steve Penny stands only with a charge of directing evidence to be removed from the ranch when he heard it was going to be raided. So
the documentary finishes with Steve Penny's arrest. So that's sometime around 2018. What happened next with Steve Penny? Because she says he's the head of USA Gymnastics. It's clear at a time when the complaints come in, he doesn't act in a legal way, doesn't do the mandatory reporting when accusations of that type are made against Larry Nassar. For 12 months, there's this sham investigation going on. What happened, Steve Penny? What was the end result, and where is he now?
Well, I mean, he goes from, as you see in the film, arrogant, cocky in a deposition while he's describing this horrible policy to being subpoenaed before the U.S. Senate and then pleading the fifth to his right not to answer questions. And then he sort of limps out. And as he limps out of the hearing, somebody from the audience yells, "Shame." He is still facing that charge from Texas. It's unclear to me why there just haven't been more investigations by law enforcement, even in Indianapolis. There were police connections to Steve Penny. There was an officer who who basically told us you're barking up the wrong tree. I've seen some of this and you're interpreting it wrong. And the person who said it was crazy. You're barking up the wrong tree. So we're waiting for for Steve Penny to face trial and justice.
Yeah, it does fit in with how trials and justice seems to be dished out around abuse cases worldwide, that you have to fight for every little piece of justice. And it certainly seemed that there was some solace earned and gained from the victim impact statements that as many of the victims as wanted were able to give standing in front of Larry Nassar. So Larry Nassar was dealt with as the main perpetrator, and maybe that gave some closure. But for him to be able to get away with so much for so long, there has to be a long string of people who knew more than they're letting on and who were able to protect them. And I'd imagine, I don't know how closely, because I know you've moved on from your job now in the Indy Star, how closely aligned you are still with the survivors. I imagine for the vast majority of them, closure will probably never come, but still they feel that justice hasn't been served while the likes of Steve Penny are still out there.
There are a few survivors in particular, including Rachel, who I'm in touch with. And like I said, they're all still working on this issue. They haven't just let this go. My goodness, Rachel went from the Nassar sentencing almost right into child sexual abuse in the Baptist church. And she's kept up with this issue. And, you know, going back to what you were saying, you're quite right that the survivors did say that being able to face Nassar and say what they wanted was helpful. And the person who gets credit for that is the prosecutor, Angie Povolitis. She not only won the guilty plea, but she was the one who said, anybody who wants to come and speak gets to do it. Any of the survivors get to speak at the hearing, at the sentencing hearing. And the Nassar side agreed. They were probably thinking there would be just a few. There were about 150. It was really poignant.
Have US Gymnastics as a body, as an organization, accepted responsibility for what's happened on their watch?
No. I haven't seen anything that was that that was anything close to the type of apology, direct apology, and admission of failures. They've gone through 2 or 3 presidents since Steve Penny. The survivors, they hear these statements all of a sudden from USA Gymnastics about the bravery of survivors and thank you for coming forward. And they kind of scoff at those. The survivors certainly don't trust USA Gymnastics. They want it decertified. They want to start over from the ground up.
Yeah, I read that they tried to do a deal with the survivors that basically to withdraw their accusations on Steve Penny, they'd give them $82,000. Yeah,
it was a bankruptcy hearing, and the offer to the survivors was contingent on letting Steve Penny off the hook, and and others off the hook in exchange for settling this whole thing. And the survivors said, no way. There's a very strong lawyer who's in the film a lot, John Manley out of California. He was Jamie Dancer's attorney at the start and then became the attorney for many of these women. Just a really strong voice. And he's out there consistently on Twitter calling out all the BS that comes from USA Gymnastics and its apologists.
How has this story, and particularly over the last couple of months with the release of the documentary, how has it affected Americans' attitude towards gymnastics and that race for the gold medal? Because in a better scenario, we'll be right in the middle of the Tokyo Olympics right now, and America will be demanding from its gymnasts medals and gold medals. Has there been any questioning about the overall way that sport as a whole in America is run and the damage that's been done to young people in chasing that dream and tracing that gold medal, or has life just moved on?
There's actually just last night, I haven't seen it yet, but another documentary premiered on HBO called The Weight of Gold. And it includes the multi-gold medal winning swimmer Michael Phelps, talking about just the crushing depression he experienced after all the hoopla of the Olympics was over. Again, I have not seen that, but really that just sort of adds to the evidence that what we see on TV, on NBC here in the U.S., all the glory, it doesn't, and often comebacks from horrible injuries and the like, to great Olympic glory and gold medals and all of that, and endorsements and everything, doesn't show what it takes to get there, and it doesn't show the aftermath. And that's why I'm looking forward to seeing this other film. And I think Athlete A. Our reporting's been out there for 4 years, and I think it got a lot of attention in the U.S. Athlete A, I think, had the most impact internationally. So I'd like to think that a lot of Americans were already there on changing attitudes about Olympic success.
Yeah, well, Mark, you and your former colleagues at the Indy Star, you did an incredible job in exposing this story and bringing down Larry Nassar, thankfully. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it.